So we need to talk about a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court involving the Fourth Amendment's protections on when excessive force by law enforcement impacts your constitutional rights. This decision is huge, and now it's moving forward at the lower court level. So let's break down what happened in this critical Supreme Court ruling. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe to the channel. Also, double check to make sure YouTube is not unsubscribed to you because they love to do that. And also, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form's an amazing company. I love their supplements. I use them every time I work out. My favorite right now is the mint chip flavor, but they also have this maple waffle that they just came out with, which is amazing. So check that out. You can check them out using the links down below. And one of the cool things about them is they're pro-freedom, pro-America, and they support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel. So links will be down below in the details section, also in the pinned comment. And if you order something $100 or more, you can get free shipping, and they also have a money-back guarantee on your order. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court. This case involves the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches and seizures, and when law enforcement in their activities, actually when they engage in excessive force, when does that impact your constitutional rights? This new ruling came in a case called Barnes versus Felix, and this new lawsuit should be on everyone's minds because it involves how courts should now analyze situations like this one going forward when police engage in excessive force. Now, although this case is not a traditional warrantless search and seizure issue and it doesn't necessarily deal with firearms, this Barnes case directly addresses the seizure doctrine and also the Fourth Amendment's implications when it comes to excessive force. Now, as gun owners, we have seen a lot of highly publicized situations where law enforcement interact with lawful gun owners, and through excessive force and these bad interactions, gun owners end up actually getting hurt or something else fatally happens. This analysis by the Supreme Court directly impacts those types of situations and involves your rights in those very scary situations. And now this ruling by the Supreme Court is impacting other cases, and this challenge also is being sent back down to the lower court for a new ruling in light of what the Supreme Court just said in that 9-0 decision. Now, the facts around this case are as follows. Roberto Felix Jr., a law enforcement officer, pulled over an individual, Ashton Barnes, for suspected toll violations. Essentially, Mr. Barnes was driving on a Texas freeway. The cameras, I believe, on the freeway picked up that he had toll violations, so he was pulled over by the officer. Now, Officer Felix ordered Barnes to exit the vehicle. Barnes initially opened the door and acted as if he was going to exit the car, but then he attempted to drive away. Now, reacting in a split second, the officer there decided to jump onto the ledge of the car. Because the door was open, he was able to essentially kind of jump on and stand on the floorboard of the vehicle as the car was driving away. He then decided to pull his weapon and fired 2 shots at Barnes as the car was driving away. Now, Barnes was fatally shot, but he did manage to stop the car before he passed away. And this all happened within a span, I believe, of 5 seconds. Now, because of this incident, Barnes' mother and father sued Officer Felix on behalf of Mr. Barnes, alleging that the officer there violated Ashton Barnes' Fourth Amendment rights against excessive force. Now, the district court on review granted summary judgment in favor of the officer, applying the Fifth Circuit's moment of threat rule. Now, the Fifth Circuit affirmed that ruling, and they explained that the moment of threat rule requires only asking whether an officer was in danger at the moment of the threat that resulted in his use of deadly force. Now, under this rule, events leading up to the shooting are not relevant at all and cannot be considered. They stated that here the precise moment of threat was the 2 seconds when Felix was clinging to the moving car as Barnes attempted to escape. And because Officer Felix could then have reasonably believed that his life was in danger, the Fifth Circuit panel there held that the shooting by the officer was lawful. This case eventually made its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the question that the Supreme Court answered in this case is whether courts should apply the moment of threat doctrine or something else when evaluating these types of Fourth Amendment claims. Now, on review, like I mentioned, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling, and they held that a claim that a law enforcement officer used excessive force during a stop or arrest is analyzed under the Fourth Amendment, which requires that the force deployed be objectively reasonable from the perspective of a reasonable officer at the scene. The inquiry, they state, into the reasonableness of the police officer and the force requires analyzing the totality of the circumstances. They state that that analysis demands careful attention to the facts and circumstances relating to the incident. So in this case, the Supreme Court rejected the more limited moment of threat analysis that was used by the Fifth Circuit and the lower court, and instead they applied the totality of the circumstances approach when it came to this type of incident. They stated that a rule like this one, which precludes consideration of prior events in assessing a police shooting, is not reconcilable with the fact-dependent and context-sensitive approach this court has prescribed. A court deciding a use of force case cannot review the totality of the circumstances if it puts on a chronological blinder. They concluded by pointing out that the court does not here address a separate question about whether and how an officer's own creation of a dangerous situation will factor into this type of reasonableness analysis. They did not consider that here. They did not necessarily look at the fact that the officer jumped on the vehicle. They left that for the lower court to also consider. So the main thrust of this ruling was rejecting the more limited scope of analysis that was applied by the moment of threat rule in the Fifth Circuit. Instead, the Supreme Court orders the lower courts here to look at the totality of the circumstances before and potentially during the incident as well. They said, situations that happened during the incident will probably be the most important, but you also need to look at things that happened before the incident. Now, like I mentioned, there was a concurrence authored by Kavanaugh that was joined by Thomas, Barrett, and Alito. And in that concurrence, they're heavily focusing on the fact that these traffic stops are very dangerous for law enforcement officers. It puts them at risk. There's a lot of shootings and fatalities that happen to officers because of these types of stops. And then also the fact that this individual drove away increased that risk to not just the police officer, but to the public at large. So they did not want to ignore that. But they said, all of these situations, all of these facts need to be looked at by the lower court. And they cannot just put on those blinders and look at the 5 seconds of the shooting and the fact that he was already on the vehicle to say that, he was in threat at the time, he was in danger at the time. They said you have to look at all the situation, you have to look at the totality of the circumstances and everything that led up to the fact that he decided to shoot. So in essence, the Supreme Court found that courts may look beyond just the moment of the threat and instead look at the totality of the situation. The Supreme Court, because of this, just issued their mandate, sending this case back down to the lower court. And now, actually, right now, this case is moving forward at the district court level. The father there, I believe he's incarcerated at the time. He's representing his son pro se. He has notified the lower court of the Supreme Court ruling, and he's currently trying to set a new trial date for a new trial in this case to look at the totality of the circumstances rather than just the moment of threat. Now, this case is important because it impacts everyone's Fourth Amendment protections against excessive force. For gun owners, this is important, especially in light of all the situations that we've seen pop up where lawful gun owners are potentially shot or harmed by police officers because of these weird interactions and these highly publicized interactions that are now happening, especially with federal agencies. So this is one of those situations and one of those cases that is isolated here to this specific, fact pattern in this specific case. But you did have the Supreme Court say, no, you just don't look at the moment of threat. You need to look at the totality of the circumstances. And that opens the door for more litigation and potentially more leeway to rule in favor of citizens in these types of situations. And this ruling also became a little bit more important because the Supreme Court recently heard oral arguments in a similar Fourth Amendment case. In that challenge, that was the case called Case versus Montana, and it dealt with law enforcement officers entering a home without a warrant. And so this was also brought up in the briefings in that Supreme Court case where they heard oral arguments, and also I believe was mentioned during those oral arguments as well. So this Barnes versus Felix case not just had a good ruling in this case and was sent back down to the lower court, but now it's also potentially going to impact another Supreme Court case that is currently waiting to be ruled on by the Supreme Court because they already held oral arguments. So this is something that we're going to be watching closely to see how it plays out. And as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe to the channel. Also, you can check out my website, armorscholar.com. Over there, we have a lot for you guys. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.